Hello and welcome to another video. In this one I'll be reacting to a Polish lieutenant colonel's take at what the Russian winter/spring offensive will be like and exactly his reasoning and all of those stuff. Starting out with the start, he calls this Operation Dagger, and he presents a hypothetical course of a probable Russian offensive in Ukraine. He developed this based on the Russian operational methodology, and given the complexity of the topic, he's limited himself to the key issues. The thread shows the course of the entire operation in stages. So the first stage here is the minimum parameters of fighting in the auxiliary direction in the first stage of the operation. Russian fire superiority is 7-1, attack up to 10 kilometers a day, main direction 2 and 3 stages, 5-1 up to 15 kilometers a day, and at the key points of the 10-1 operation, average in operation 3-1 and up to 10 kilometers a day. I don't understand this part completely, as he mentions a 7-1 advantage, which will advance 10 kilometers a day, while... No, he's talking about how much he expects them to advance within a single day. And then he's separated into 3 directions, where the main direction is over here, and then they're advancing in this direction, which will be a fire superiority of 7-1 and advancing 10 kilometers a day. Then there's the second direction, which is down here, or down south, which will be 15 kilometers a day at a 10-1 advantage, and then finally down in the south, which will be a 3-1 advantage and 10 kilometers a day. That makes more sense now. Moving on to the next one, he explains the first stage of this operation. Hitting the first throw in the auxiliary direction from the east to the direction of Kiev, pressure in the northern direction, regional grouping of forces, and in the Donbass, Russian achieve a strategic surprise as to the strength and direction of the strike. So essentially he's saying that from the north will be an attack against Chernihiv just to distract the Ukrainian forces, and at the same time they'll continue their attacks here in the eastern direction, in the Donbass direction, as well as in the Luhansk as well as to the north of Luhansk, and they just continue their attacks as they have been, but they have a major grouping of forces here in Sumy, which they will use to launch an offensive north of Sumy and in the western direction towards Kiev. Moving on to the next point, he talks about Zapad 2017. The topic of strategic redeployment is strongly emphasized by Russian and regularly trained, whether in own or allied exercises. An example is Zapad 2017 and the annual exercise of the Krebs Railway Troops, Echelon. So this is Echelon and this is Zapad 2017. So in both of these cases, it is a training which is focused at rapidly redeploying a large amount of troops. Zapad 2017 is, for example, an exercise where Lithuania and Poland invade Belarus, and they have to strategically, rapidly redeploy their troops to come into defense of Belarus, and similar in the Echelon exercise. So essentially what he's saying is that they can transport tens of thousands of troops, 60 to 100,000, rapidly redeploying those troops to the front line at a very short time in a period of 2 to 3 days. So essentially what he's saying is that the Russian forces will use this exercise training to rapidly redeploy their troops to the Sumy region in 2 to 3 days and then launch their offensive as soon as they arrive. As for the next point he makes is that the strategic or operational surprise is achieved by the Russians through this of the main forces of the operational union in the direction of the strike no later than 3 days before the start of the operation. So 3 days before the start of the operation, they relocate all of their troops to that area, and then they start the offensive. First throw of units up to 24 hours, for second throw 72 hours, and the third flush is about 2 to 3 weeks. So essentially he says there will be 3 steps in this process. The first one, they will launch all of their forces within the first day. Then there's the second thrust, which is 72 hours after. And then there's the third, which is 3 weeks after. Let's move on to the next point, which is number 6. The OC's entry into combat is smooth. A few days or a week before the strike, elements of the reconnaissance and forward command system are deployed along with support units. Nevertheless, it is difficult to clearly state the intention of action. They often maneuver or demonstrate. So essentially, they are saying here that with the strategic deployment, the Ukrainians would initially be confused as to the intention of the Russian forces with this redeployment, as they often, throughout this war and prior to the war, strategically deploy their troops everywhere, so that the Ukrainians are always on their toes. So essentially, the Ukrainians would not know if it is a ruse, a trick, or if they're actually going for an offensive. The next point he makes is number 7. The second stage of the operation, which is 5 to 6 days, is the entry of the second wave. Continued attacks towards Kiev, at the same time an attack of the south flanking the main forces of the Ukrainian armed forces in Ukraine. So essentially, they will be pushing westwards and then southwards to flank the Ukrainian positions. And at the same time, a offensive from the Zaporizhia region to flank the Ukrainian forces in the Donbas region. So they're attacking from the northwest and from the southwest, while at the same time also attacking the direction of Zaporizhia. The next point, which is the 8th point out of 10, the third stage of the operation, which is on day 10 to 12, is entry of all of the forces of the second echelon simultaneously with the planned change of the direction of the main attack from east to south and the continuation of the attack from south to north. At the same time, strikes are made on the Dnieper crossings. So essentially what it says here is that they will destroy all of the bridges across the Dnieper River here in the southern area. And at the same time, they'll continue pushing southwards against Poltava and against the western regions of eastern Ukraine, while at the same time continuing northwards in the direction of the Dnieper city, as well as Zaporizhia itself, and continuing their flanking maneuvers against the Ukrainian forces in the Donbas, while at the same time attacking in the direction of Kharkiv to keep the Ukrainian forces in that direction, while they're flanking here to the west, and attacking head-on the whole Donbas region. So essentially a full frontal assault in the southeast, a flanking maneuver in the southwest, as well as in the northeast, in this direction of Sumy, and the continuous defensive positions here by the borderline in the direction of Chernihiv, and defending their flanks here to the north. So a operation to completely capture eastern Ukraine. Then moving on to point number 9. Here he claims that such an operation would eventually reach the place where the southern grouping connects with the northern grouping, completely encircling the Ukrainian forces in Kharkiv as well as in the Donbas region, allowing the Russian forces to completely encircle these forces, while at the same time having destroyed the bridges across the Dnieper River, which refuses the Ukrainians from sending reinforcements across, and at the same time sieging Kiev from the east, which will prevent any crossing in that area. So a full collapse of the Ukrainian armed forces in southeastern Ukraine in the Donbas region, which has the majority of the Ukrainian forces. Then the final point, taking into account the changes in the Russian command and previous actions such as reducing artillery fire, forcing Ukraine to disperse air defense units over critical infrastructure, disappearance of many select units from the front line, something is afoot. If you like it, pass it on. Okay, so essentially this is the conclusion of his analysis, and he claims that 3 things are increasing the risks of a Russian offensive in the eastern Ukraine. The first one is that the Russian forces have reduced artillery fire. This could indicate that they're building up a lot of artillery stockpiles by the front line for a possible offensive. They have a lot of artillery shells. They are constructing about 10,000 shells a day, and currently they're firing about 5 to 10,000 a day, which means that they're holding at a level that is replaceable, which doesn't make sense because if they had a stockpile, then they would use more than they are producing. So they're currently conserving the amount of artillery shells they have, and that would only be the case in case they are launching an offensive. The second thing is the missile strikes across all of Ukrainian territory. Because they are attacking Kiev, Lviv, and all of these areas in western Ukraine, the Ukrainian forces have to disperse their air defense systems everywhere in the country to protect all the places. If they just suddenly decided to stop defending Odessa or Kiev or Lviv, then the Russian forces could just launch artillery missile strikes all over the areas without any issues. So they have to defend everywhere, which makes everywhere weak. This means that the Russian forces, once they launch an offensive, will have the advantage when it comes to that. And then the final part is the disappearance, quote unquote, of many select units from the front. There's a lot of units that the Russian forces have been using throughout the war, and then we're suddenly seeing less units on the front. For example, currently we're seeing at most 400,000 Russian troops on the front line, while the Russian forces have over 800,000 troops ready to serve in combat. Which means that the Russian forces have a whole second army in reserve. That could only indicate that they are waiting with them either for rotation or for an offensive. And my estimate and his estimate is that it is for an offensive, which is why every think tank in Western Europe, as well as government officials and NATO General Secretary Jens Stoltenberg, have all said an upcoming offensive is definite. That is because of all of these factors, all pointing at the same thing. So essentially, we're seeing that the Russian forces are determined to take control over eastern Ukraine, and this also aligns with Sergei Lavrov's statement of we will prevent the Ukrainian forces from attacking artillery strikes into Russian territory. If they control all of eastern Ukraine, except for Kherson and Zaporizhia, the Ukrainians will not be able to launch into Russian territory, considering that Russians consider Kherson and Zaporizhia as part of Russian territory. So they'll still need to cross the Dnieper River to completely take control over their annexed territories and to completely protect them. But until that point, this is what I estimate and he estimates to be the offensive. I agree with a lot of his points, and generally this looks a lot like the analysis I did a couple of days ago, the 2nd of February. So you can go check that out if you're interested. But yeah, essentially I agree with a lot of his points, and I do believe that this is the Russian plan. Whether or not it succeeds, that is up to time to tell. That's going to be all for this video. Thank you all for watching. Hope you all enjoyed, and have a great day.